The bitter Colorado wind whistled through the cracks of the cabin walls as Lydia Keller sat hunched over on a crude wooden stool, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the cold, dead ashes in the fireplace. It was January 1882, and the merciless winter had descended upon the small homestead with a vengeance that seemed to mirror the emptiness in her heart since burying her husband Thomas 3 months prior. The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered through her grief. Lydia had stopped expecting visitors weeks ago when the last of the neighboring families had stopped bringing food and condolences. At 26, she was too young to be a widow, they'd all said. Too pretty to waste away on this remote patch of land 15 miles outside of Silverton. But what did they know of the promises she'd made to Thomas? Of the dream they'd shared to build something lasting from this harsh but beautiful wilderness? A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Lydia wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron and rose unsteadily, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. When she opened the door, the rush of cold air nearly took her breath away. "Beg your pardon, madam." A tall figure stood before her, his face partially obscured by a worn leather hat dusted with snow. "My name's Vaughn Landry. I've been riding since dawn and spotted your chimney. Was hoping to warm up a spell if you wouldn't mind." Lydia stared at him wordlessly, taking in his frost-covered beard and the way he shifted his weight to favor his right leg. His clothes were travel-worn but respectable, and despite his imposing height, there was something in his blue eyes that didn't seem threatening. "Your fire's gone out," he observed, glancing past her to the darkened hearth. "It's been out for some time," Lydia replied, her voice rough from disuse. She hesitated before stepping aside. "You can come in, but there's not much warmth to be found here." The stranger Vaughn nodded gratefully and limped inside, removing his hat to reveal a shock of chestnut hair. He surveyed the cabin with a careful gaze, noting the modest furnishings, the neatly made bed in the corner, and the wooden table with 2 chairs, one of which had a layer of dust. "You're alone out here?" he asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. "My husband died of fever in October," Lydia answered simply. She didn't know why she was telling him this, a perfect stranger, but the words tumbled out unbidden. Vaughn nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry to hear that, madam," he gestured to the fireplace. "Would you mind if I got that going again? It's colder in here than it is outside, if you don't mind my saying." A flicker of shame crossed Lydia's face. Once she'd been known for her hospitality. "The wood's wet, I haven't been keeping up with things." Without comment, Vaughn crossed to the fireplace and knelt down, wincing slightly. He examined the pile of logs stacked nearby, selecting a few and arranging them in the grate. From his saddlebag, he produced a small bundle of dry kindling and some newspaper. "Always carry these for emergencies," he explained, working methodically. "Never know when you'll need to start a fire in a hurry out on the trail." Lydia watched as his large hands moved with surprising delicacy, building a careful structure of kindling. He struck a match and soon a tiny flame appeared, timid at first but growing steadily as he added more tinder. Within minutes, the fire was crackling cheerfully, casting warm light throughout the cabin for the first time in days. "There," he said, standing with some effort. "That should take the chill off." Lydia felt something stir within her, not happiness exactly, but perhaps a distant cousin to it. "Thank you," she said quietly. I suppose I've let things go." Vaughn's eyes softened. "Grief does that to a person, no shame in it." He glanced toward the window where snow was beginning to fall more heavily. "Looks like that storm's setting in. I should probably see to my horse before it gets worse." "You can put him in the barn," Lydia offered. "There's still hay from last summer." "Much obliged, madam." He donned his hat and headed for the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "I'll bring in more wood when I come back, if that's all right." After he left, Lydia stood motionless, staring at the flickering flames. The fire seemed to awaken something in the cabin or perhaps in her. She moved closer, extending her hands toward the warmth, and for the first time in months she felt the chill begin to recede from her bones. By the time Vaughn returned, stamping snow from his boots and carrying an armload of wood, Lydia had swept the floor and was heating water for coffee. She hadn't planned to do these things. Her body had simply remembered how to perform the tasks that had once been as natural as breathing. "Your horse is settled," Vaughn said, carefully stacking the wood beside the hearth. "Fine animal, thoroughbred mix, Morgan," Lydia corrected. "Thomas bred horses. That one's the last of our stock. The others were sold after." She trailed off, busying herself with the coffee, good breed, strong and loyal. Vaughn removed his coat, revealing broad shoulders and a lean frame hardened by outdoor work. A dark stain on his trouser leg caught Lydia's attention. "You're bleeding," she said, setting down the coffee pot. Vaughn glanced at his leg with mild surprise. "Appears I am. Must have opened up again." "Sit down," Lydia instructed, already moving to retrieve the small medical kit she kept in a trunk. When Vaughn hesitated, she added more softly, "Please." He lowered himself onto a chair, extending his right leg gingerly. "It's nothing serious." "Had a run-in with a territorial bull about a week back. Thought it was healing fine." Lydia knelt beside him, examining the blood seeping through his pants. "You'll need to remove these so I can clean it properly." A hint of color touched Vaughn's weathered cheeks, but he nodded, waiting until Lydia turned away before unbuckling his belt and carefully easing the trousers down to reveal a nasty gash on his upper thigh. "That's not from a bull," Lydia said immediately, turning back with a basin of water. "That's a knife wound." Their eyes met, and Vaughn seemed to be weighing his response. "You have a good eye, Mrs. Keller, Lydia Keller." "Mrs. Keller, you're right, it wasn't a bull. Had a disagreement with a fellow in Durango. He took exception to losing at cards." "Was he a fair loser at least?" Lydia asked dryly, cleaning the wound with more gentleness than her tone suggested. A surprised chuckle escaped Vaughn's lips. "Not particularly, but I left him in better shape than he left me." Lydia applied a salve of her own making and wrapped the wound with clean bandages. "This should help, but you should stay off it as much as possible for a few days." "Thank you kindly, but I'll be moving on come morning." Lydia stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "In this weather, with that leg." "That would be foolish, Mr. Landry, and you don't strike me as a foolish man." Outside, the wind howled as if to emphasize her point. Vaughn looked toward the window, then back at the fire, which was now burning strongly. "I don't want to impose," he said finally. "You've already brought in wood and lit the fire when I couldn't bring myself to do it," Lydia replied. "I think we're past worrying about imposition." That night, Lydia lay in her bed while Vaughn slept on a pallet near the fire. She listened to his deep, even breathing and realized it was the first night since Thomas died that she hadn't cried herself to sleep. Instead, she watched the firelight dance across the ceiling and felt something like peace settle over her. Morning brought a world transformed. Snow blanketed everything in sight, pristine and glittering in the early sunlight. Lydia awoke to find Vaughn already up, his injured leg apparently not hindering him from stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. "Hope you don't mind," he said, when he noticed her watching. "Figured it was the least I could do." Lydia sat up, suddenly conscious of her rumpled appearance and tangled hair. "Not at all, though you should be resting that leg." "Been tending to myself too long to stay idle," Vaughn replied with a half smile. "Besides, I checked your stores. You're running low on just about everything." It was true. Lydia had been living on dwindling supplies for weeks, lacking both the will and energy to make the journey into town. "I'll manage," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure how. Vaughn studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the window. "Storm's passed, but there's another brewing to the west. I'd say we have about a day before it hits, enough time for me to ride into town and back if we're quick about it." Lydia questioned, rising from bed and quickly putting on her robe. "I thought you might want to come along, get some fresh air supplies." He paused, then added more carefully, "Sometimes the worst thing for grief is sitting alone with it." Lydia wanted to bristle at his presumption, but found she couldn't. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding, and perhaps he was right. Perhaps she had been allowing herself to wither away alongside her memories. "Very well," she conceded, "but you're not riding with that leg." "We'll take the wagon." An hour later, they were headed toward Silverton, the wagon creaking beneath them as it cut through the fresh snow. Vaughn handled the reins with easy confidence, and Lydia sat beside him wrapped in her warmest cloak, watching the wilderness unfold around them. "How long have you been on your own?" Vaughn asked after they'd traveled in companionable silence for a while. 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, Lydia answered without hesitation. Vaughn nodded as if this precise counting was the most natural thing in the world. "And before that?" "You mentioned Thomas bred horses. We came out from Kansas 5 years ago. Thomas had a dream of starting a horse ranch, breeding stock for the silver mines and cattle operations." A wistful smile touched her lips. He always had big plans. "We were just beginning to see them come to fruition when he fell ill." "And now," Lydia hesitated. "Now I don't know. The neighbors think I should sell and move back east to my sister in Boston. They say a woman alone has no business trying to run a homestead." "And what do you think?" "I think." Lydia paused, surprised to find tears threatening. "I think I haven't been able to think at all. I've just been existing. Barely." Vaughn's gaze remained on the trail ahead, giving her the privacy to compose herself. "Grief has a way of stopping time," he said finally. "Makes you feel like you're trapped in amber while the world moves on without you." The insight struck Lydia with its accuracy. "You sound like you know something about it. Lost my wife and daughter to typhoid back in '75. He said it matter-of-factly, but Lydia could hear the undercurrent of pain. "Sarah was 22, our little girl Emma had just turned 3. "I'm so sorry," Lydia said softly. Vaughn nodded his acknowledgement. "Took to wandering after that. Worked cattle drives, did some scouting for the army, tried my hand at prospecting. Nothing felt right, so I just kept moving. And now," he glanced at her, a rueful smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Now I'm headed to a job at the Double R Ranch near Telluride. Friend of mine is the foreman there." The revelation that he was indeed planning to move on shouldn't have disappointed Lydia, but somehow it did. She'd known him less than a day, yet his presence had brought a warmth to her life that had been absent for too long. Silverton appeared ahead of them, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear winter sky. Despite the snow, the streets were busy with miners, merchants, and townsfolk going about their business. As they pulled up to the general store, several people stopped to stare. Lydia realized with some discomfort that she had become something of a curiosity, the widow who had retreated into solitude, now suddenly appearing in town with a strange man. "Mrs. Keller," the shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Patterson, greeted her with barely concealed surprise as they entered. "We'd begun to worry about you out there all alone." "I'm managing just fine, Mrs. Patterson," Lydia replied with more confidence than she felt. "And who might this gentleman be?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes darted to Vaughn, who was removing his hat respectfully. "Vaughn Landry, madam," he introduced himself. "Just passing through and stopped to lend Mrs. Keller a hand with some supplies." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "Well, that's mighty neighborly of you, Mr. Landry. We've all been concerned about Mrs. Keller since her husband's passing." "So concerned that no one's checked on me in over a month," Lydia couldn't help asking, the words sharper than she'd intended. Mrs. Patterson had the grace to look abashed. "The winter's been hard on everyone, dear, but you're right, we should have made more of an effort." Vaughn smoothly changed the subject, inquiring about various supplies they needed. As they shopped, Lydia noticed how he subtly steered her toward practical items she hadn't thought to purchase: lamp oil, matches, salt, sugar, coffee, and flour in quantities that would last for weeks. "You don't need to do this," she murmured as he added another sack of beans to their growing pile. "Consider it repayment for the medical attention and lodging," he replied. When it came time to pay, Vaughn insisted on covering the bulk of the cost. "I'll be eating my share of this food for at least a few days," he said when Lydia protested. That leg of mine isn't going anywhere fast in this weather." Mrs. Patterson watched this exchange with undisguised interest, and Lydia could practically see the gossip taking shape behind the woman's eyes. But for once, she found she didn't care what people thought. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Sheriff Miller approached them, his badge glinting in the winter sunlight. "Mrs. Keller," he greeted, tipping his hat. His gaze shifted to Vaughn, assessing. "Don't believe we've met, Mr. Vaughn Landry," Vaughn replied, extending his hand, which the sheriff shook after a moment's hesitation. "What brings you to our parts, Mr. Landry?" "Headed to Telluride for work. Got caught in the storm, and Mrs. Keller was kind enough to offer shelter." The sheriff nodded, but his expression remained wary. "We look after our own here in Silverton. Mrs. Keller has been through a lot." Lydia felt a flare of irritation. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but Mr. Landry has been nothing but a gentleman. In fact, he's done more to help me in one day than anyone else has in weeks." Sheriff Miller had the decency to look chagrined. "Just doing my job, madam, no offense meant." He touched his hat again. "You folks best get on back before that next storm hits." "Looks like it's moving in faster than expected." Indeed, dark clouds were gathering on the western horizon as they set out for the homestead. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Lydia found herself sitting closer to Vaughn than before, grateful for his solid presence beside her. They were perhaps halfway home when the snow began to fall, fat flakes that quickly turned into a blinding curtain of white. Vaughn squinted against the onslaught, his grip tightening on the reins. "We might have misjudged this one," he admitted, his voice nearly lost in the howl of the wind. Lydia peered anxiously ahead. "There's a line shack about a mile from here. Old Johnson used it when he ran cattle through this valley. If we can make it there, we'll have shelter until this passes." Vaughn nodded grimly and urged the horses forward. The animals were struggling now, the wagon wheels cutting deep trenches in the rapidly accumulating snow. Lydia strained her eyes, trying to make out familiar landmarks through the whiteout conditions. "There," she finally cried, pointing to a dark shape looming ahead. "That's it." The shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a small corral attached, but it offered blessed relief from the storm. Vaughn unhitched the horses and led them into the sheltered area while Lydia fumbled with frozen fingers to light the old lantern that hung just inside the door. The interior was sparse but serviceable: a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, and a narrow cot against one wall. Dust covered every surface, but it was dry and out of the wind. "Let's get a fire going," Vaughn said, stomping snow from his boots. He moved to the stove and began clearing out old ashes, while Lydia searched for kindling among the supplies stacked in one corner. Working together, they soon had a small fire crackling in the stove. Vaughn brought in some of their supplies from the wagon, including a pot for melting snow into drinking water and some coffee. As the tiny cabin began to warm, they shed their outer layers and settled in to wait out the storm. "Reminds me of the first place Thomas and I lived when we came west," Lydia remarked, looking around. "Barely bigger than this, with a roof that leaked every time it rained, but we were so happy." Vaughn smiled, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Sarah and I started out in a tent. Graduated to a soddy after Emma was born. She used to say our palace awaited us, we just had to build it first. She sounds wonderful, she was. Strongest woman I ever knew, gentle too, though, like you." The unexpected compliment brought warmth to Lydia's cheeks. "I don't feel very strong." "Yet here you are," Vaughn observed, "still standing despite everything." "That's strength, Mrs. Keller." "Lydia," she corrected softly. "I think, given our circumstances, you might call me Lydia." "Lydia," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name on his tongue. Outside, the wind shrieked around the corners of the shack, but inside, a different kind of electricity was building. Lydia was acutely aware of Vaughn's presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the thoughtful expression in his eyes, the way his hands cradled the tin cup as if it were fine china. "Tell me about your plans," she said, partly to distract herself from these unsettling observations. After Telluride, I mean. Vaughn considered this, gazing into the depths of his coffee. Haven't thought that far ahead, to be honest. One job leads to another, one trail to the next. Doesn't it get lonely, always moving on? Sometimes, he admitted. But staying in one place, that has its own kind of loneliness too. Their eyes met across the small space, and Lydia felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared pain, but also of something else, something tentative and new. The storm raged through the night, forcing them to share the narrow cot for warmth. Lydia lay awake, intensely conscious of Vaughn's proximity, of the respectful distance he maintained even in such close quarters. It had been so long since she'd felt the comfort of another person's presence, the simple human connection of sharing space and breath. When morning came, the world outside was transformed into a pristine white landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a breathtaking stillness. Vaughn stepped outside to check on the horses while Lydia prepared a simple breakfast from their supplies. "It's beautiful," she said when he returned, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. "Like everything's been made new." "That it is," he agreed, though his eyes were on her rather than the scene outside. They ate in companionable silence, then packed up their things and prepared to continue their journey. The going was slow through the deep snow, but the sky was clear, and the air crisp with promise. When they finally reached the homestead, Lydia was struck by how different it looked to her now, not as a place of sorrow and isolation, but as a home waiting to be reclaimed. Vaughn insisted on unloading the supplies and tending to the horses before seeing to his own comfort. By the time they settled before the hearth that evening, a new sense of order had been restored to the cabin. The fire burned brightly, and Lydia had prepared a proper meal for the first time in months. "You're good at this," she observed as Vaughn carefully split kindling for the morning fire. He glanced up, a question in his eyes. "Making things whole again," she clarified. "The fire, the barn, even the horses seem to stand straighter since you've been here." Vaughn set down his knife. "I haven't done anything special." "You helped me remember how to live," Lydia said simply. "That feels special to me." The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Vaughn's leg needed more time to heal properly, and the winter seemed determined to keep them snowbound with a series of storms. They worked side by side, repairing small things around the homestead that had fallen into disrepair during Lydia's months of grief. In the evenings, they shared stories by the fire. Vaughn told tales of his travels, cattle drives in Texas, gold mining in California, the characters he'd met along the way. Lydia spoke of her childhood in Massachusetts, of Thomas and their dreams, of the beauty she'd found in this wild country despite its hardships. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, something began to bloom between them. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was understanding, respect, a recognition of shared values and compatible spirits. One evening, as they sat before the fire after a day of clearing paths through the snow, Vaughn asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. "What will you do when spring comes, Lydia? Will you stay or go back east, as the neighbors suggested?" Lydia gazed into the flames, considering. "A month ago, I couldn't have answered that. I couldn't see beyond my grief." She looked up at him. "But now, this is my home. Thomas and I built it together, but that doesn't mean it died with him. I want to stay to see our dream through in my own way." Relief flickered across Vaughn's features. "I'm glad to hear that. And you?" Lydia asked, her heart quickening. "Will you still go to Telluride when the pass is clear?" Vaughn set aside the piece of wood he'd been whittling and leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. "I've been thinking about that. The double R will find another man easily enough, and I find myself less inclined to move on than I used to be." "Is that so?" Lydia tried to keep her voice steady despite the hope rising within her. "This place," Vaughn gestured around them, "it has good bones. Thomas had vision choosing this valley. With some work, it could be everything he dreamed and more." "It would take more than one person to make that happen," Lydia pointed out. "That it would," Vaughn agreed, holding her gaze. Two people working together could make something remarkable here. The implication hung between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Lydia took a deep breath. "Are you offering to stay on as a hired hand, Mr. Landry?" A slow smile spread across his face. "That's not exactly what I had in mind, Mrs. Keller." He moved to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "I know it's sudden. I know we've only known each other a short while. But I also know that sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of a complicated joy. "Thomas would want you to be happy," Vaughn finished gently, "just as Sarah would want the same for me. We don't dishonor their memory by finding happiness again. We honor them by living fully as they would have wanted." Lydia squeezed his hands. "People will talk, they'll say it's too soon. Let them talk, we know our own hearts." And she did know, Lydia realized. Somehow, in the span of weeks, this man had rekindled not just her hearth but her spirit. It wasn't that he had replaced Thomas, no one ever could. But he had shown her that her heart was still capable of feeling, of connecting, of looking toward the future rather than dwelling in the past. "I'm not asking for an answer now," Vaughn continued. "Just for you to consider the possibility of us together building something here." Lydia touched his cheek, feeling the rough texture of his beard beneath her fingers. "I don't need time to consider. I already know what I want." When their lips met, it felt like coming home to a place she hadn't known existed. There was tenderness in Vaughn's kiss and respect, but also a passion that spoke of life continuing, of new beginnings forged from the ashes of what had been lost. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers carpeting the valley, and new calves in the small herd they'd purchased from a neighboring ranch. Lydia stood on the porch of the cabin, expanded now with a new room Vaughn had built through the last weeks of winter, and watched as he worked with a young colt in the corral. They'd been married by the circuit preacher just as the first crocuses pushed through the melting snow. There had been talk, of course, but less than Lydia had feared. Perhaps the townspeople recognized what she and Vaughn had discovered, that grief and joy could coexist, that moving forward didn't mean forgetting what came before. Thomas's dream of a horse ranch was taking shape, albeit in a different form than he might have envisioned. Vaughn's experience with cattle had led them to diversify, creating a mixed operation that promised more stability through the unpredictable seasons of the high country. At night, they would sit before the hearth that had once been cold and dead, planning their future together. Sometimes Lydia would think of that January day when a stranger had knocked on her door and relit her fire. How close she had come to turning him away, to remaining frozen in her grief. "Penny for your thoughts," Vaughn said now, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. His chin rested on top of her head, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of him. "I was just thinking about how a single moment can change everything," she replied. "If you hadn't stopped that day, I would have found you eventually," he said with certainty. "Some things are meant to be, Lydia, like a fire that's just waiting for someone to strike the match." She turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face that had become so dear to her. "Then I'm glad you were the one who lit mine." Their kiss was gentle, a promise renewed with each passing day. Around them, the homestead hummed with life and purpose, horses nickering in the corral, chickens scratching in the yard, seeds pushing up through the soil of the garden Lydia had planted. From cold ashes, they had built a flame that warmed them both, proving that even in the depths of winter, spring is always waiting to return.